November 14th, 1888. Sierra Valley, Arizona Territory. Temperature dropping to 35 degrees Fahrenheit. With the sun still up, Serafina Bellwether stood at the edge of her brother-in-law's claim, holding everything she owned in a flour sack, watching smoke rise from the chimney of what used to be her home. Her sister wouldn't even look at her from the doorway. The accusation had been simple enough theft of $3 silver from the household tin, and Silas's word carried more weight than hers ever would. Didn't matter that she'd never touched that money. Didn't matter that she'd worked their claim for 18 months after her husband froze to death checking trap lines. What mattered was Silas wanted the land consolidated, wanted her gone, and her sister had chosen survival over blood. The nearest settlement was Tombstone, 50 miles west, across dry prairie, with winter already painting the Dragoon Mountains white. She didn't head for Tombstone. Serafina had noticed the sandstone formations 4 miles east during a water haul the previous spring. Cliff faces honeycombed with wind-carved alcoves, some shallow as a dog's bed, others cutting back 25 feet or more into the rock. Most folks avoided the area Apache hunting grounds until recently, and the tribal memory ran long in these territories. But Serafina had grown up in the Bavarian foothills of Germany before the failed uprising of '63 sent her family across the Atlantic. She'd seen shepherds weather entire winters in underground shelters, emerging in spring with their flocks intact, while valley farmers dug out from collapsed roofs. The principle was simple enough. Earth held temperature steady when air went wild. 20 feet of rock overhead didn't care if the wind hit 60 miles per hour or the mercury dropped to 30 below. She reached the formations. By dusk, chose the deepest alcove she could find, a chamber roughly 10 feet wide, 20 feet deep, ceiling height varying from 6 feet at the entrance to barely 4 at the back. The floor sloped upward toward the rear, which suited her fine. Heat rises, cold settles. She'd sleep at the high end. First night, she huddled against the back wall, wrapped in both dresses she owned, listening to coyotes work the draws below. Temperature inside the cave held steady around 40 degrees, while outside dropped to 15. No wind penetration past the first 6 feet. By morning, she'd made her decision. Silas's claim had taught her rough carpentry. Her husband had been useless with tools, all talk about trapping fortunes, while she'd chinked their cabin walls and built their furniture. She spent the next 4 days scavenging. Cottonwood deadfall from the creek bottom, each piece carried 3 miles uphill. She found an abandoned railroad survey shack from '70, pulled 10 boards from its collapsing walls before the whole structure gave up and pancaked into the sage. Retrieved 6 feet of rusted chain, 3 bent nails, a cracked shovel blade. On the 5th day, she traded her wedding ring for a handsaw with 7 broken teeth, a hammer missing half its handle, and a tarpaulin that had more holes than fabric to a freighter passing on the Vulture Trail. The freighter had looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Winter's coming hard, ma'am. That ring could have bought you passage to Tucson." She'd just smiled. Passage to Tucson meant starting over with nothing, sleeping in charity houses, competing with 200 other desperate souls for laundry work that paid 15 cents a day. The cave wasn't charity. By November 28th, she'd constructed a front wall for the cave. Nothing fancy. Vertical cottonwood poles set 18 inches apart. Gaps, chinked with clay, from the creek bank, mixed with dry grass. The whole affair braced by horizontal stringers, lashed with strips, cut her from her husband's leather belt. Left a doorway on the south side, 3 feet wide, covered it with The tarpaulin weighted by rocks built a second interior wall 8 feet inside the first, creating an air gap that would trap heat like a double-glazed window traps light. The rear section she reserved for storage and sleeping. For a stove, she'd found a solution that would have made her grandmother proud. Dug a fire pit 18 inches deep at the cave's mouth, lined it with flat stones, constructed a chimney from stacked rocks and clay that vented smoke along the cave ceiling and out through a gap at the entrance. Drew air from outside, heated the stones, sent exhaust away from living space. Same principle as a Bavarian piece that had kept her family warm when Napoleon's armies were still burning Moscow. The settlement at Silver Creek, 15 miles west, had opinions about her cave dwelling. Jedediah Stone, who'd homesteaded the area in '68 and survived 2 winters, that killed off lesser men, didn't hide his skepticism. You're living in a hole in the ground with winter coming on. Ma'am, I've seen what happens when folks get creative about shelter. Found the O'Malley family in March of '71, all 4 of them frozen in their dugout when ventilation plugged with snow. He'd been repairing harnesses in front of the mercantile hands, working leather with practice deficiency. Rock doesn't burn like wood, but it doesn't breathe either. You get sealed in there with a fire going, the smoke'll kill you before the cold does. Father Elias Thorne had different concerns. When he found her cave in early December, "My child, this is not shelter. This is desperation. A woman alone in a cave 4 miles from the nearest Christian soul." He'd shaken his head. "I've buried 15 souls in this territory since August. Most of them had better shelter than this. There's no shame in accepting help from the church." She'd thanked him politely and kept working. December brought validation she didn't ask for but couldn't deny. Temperature dropped below 0 on the 8th and stayed there for 6 days straight. Serafina woke each morning in the back of her cave where the air held steady at 42 degrees, walked forward to her fire pit where residual heat from the previous night's stones kept the front chamber at 38 degrees. Stepped outside into air so cold it turned breath to ice crystals before it could rise. The fire pit system worked better than she'd hoped. 1 good burn with cottonwood, coals before bed. Stones would hold heat for 9 hours. She'd insulated the rear chamber by hanging her tarpaulin as a ceiling, creating a pocket of trapped air that raised the temperature another 4 degrees. Condensation from breathing froze on the tarpaulin's underside, which she scraped off each morning and melted for washing water. Waste nothing. Her grandmother had taught her that in a different language, different century, but the principle crossed oceans just fine. Food was the harder problem. She'd managed to trade work for supplies in Silver Creek, mucking stables, hauling water jobs that paid in flour and salt pork, set snares along the creek, caught 2 rabbits in 2 weeks. Not enough. A woman needed 2,000 calories minimum to maintain weight during winter. The rabbits gave her maybe 500 calories total. Flour and salt pork would last through January if she rationed carefully, maybe into early February. After that, things would get interesting. The cave's thermal properties would have pleased an engineer. The sandstone absorbed heat during the day, not from sunlight, but from her fire pit, and her own body heat in the sealed rear chamber released it slowly overnight. Maybe 3 degrees of swing instead of the 40-degree swings folks in Silver Creek dealt with in their cabins. But 3 degrees meant the difference between waking comfortable and waking to frozen water buckets. It meant being able to work inside without gloves, being able to think clearly instead of fighting constant shivers. Temperature regulation was one thing. The cave offered something else. Silence. Not the quiet of an empty room, but the profound absence of wind noise that defined every wooden structure on the Arizona frontier. 20 feet back from the entrance, sound dampened to nothing. She could hear her heartbeat, could hear mice in the walls, could hear on still nights wolves in the high peaks 15 miles away. The silence became its own comfort, a reminder that she'd built something solid enough to exclude the chaos outside. Like a lot of things on the frontier, if you wanted folks to believe something worked, you couldn't tell them. You had to let them discover it themselves. And if you're enjoying this story of frontier survival and the traditional knowledge that kept people alive in impossible conditions, consider subscribing to this channel. We're documenting the techniques and wisdom that built this country, one forgotten story at a time. Help us preserve this history before it's completely lost. The discovery came courtesy of Lars Bjornsson, a Swedish immigrant who'd filed a claim 4 miles south. Lars had built a cabin using railroad ties, pitched the roof steep to shed snow, installed a sheet metal stove he'd bought in Tucson for $18. On December 19th, he'd stopped by to offer charity potatoes, dried beef, a lecture about proper Christian living. She'd accepted the food and ignored the lecture. 2 days later, he was back asking to stay the night. His cabin had proved less waterproof than advertised, chinked the gaps with clay that cracked when it dried, and the first heavy snow melted on his hot roof, ran down to the eaves, refroze into ice dams that directed meltwater straight through his walls. Everything inside was damp. He'd spent 3 nights trying to sleep in wet blankets while his stove consumed soggy firewood that produced more smoke than heat. Serafina had let him sleep in her front chamber, watched him wake up dry for the first time in 4 days, watched him notice that her stored firewood was perfectly seasoned because the cave's humidity stayed constant. At 40%, watched him stand at her entrance and realize that 3 feet of rock overhead meant 0 snow accumulation, 0 ice dams, 0 meltwater problems. He came back the next night and the next. On the 4th night, he brought his tools and asked if she'd mind if he improved her door system. By Christmas, he'd constructed a proper door frame with a door that actually closed, reinforced her interior wall, and started referring to the space as our cave in a way that suggested he'd forgotten it was hers. Serafina didn't mind. Lars worked hard, didn't complain, and split firewood with an efficiency she couldn't match. Also, his claim meant he had legal access to supplies she could only scrounge for. First week of January, he brought lumber from Silver Creek, real milled boards, not cottonwood salvage, and built a sleeping platform in the rear chamber that kept them 8 inches off the cold floor, hung canvas to divide the sleeping area into separate spaces because propriety mattered even in caves, built a table and 2 chairs from lumber scraps, constructed a proper storage system for their combined food supplies. The cave was becoming a cabin, just happened to be inside a mountain instead of on top of it. Other folks noticed. By mid-January, 3 more settlers had asked to overnight in the cave's front chamber during particularly brutal cold snaps. Serafina and Lars developed a system. Visitors could use the front chamber, but they had to contribute firewood and couldn't stay more than 2 nights without working off their debt. The cave became an unofficial warming station, a place where frozen freighters could thaw before making the final push to Tombstone, where riders caught between settlements could wait out ground blizzards that reduced visibility to arm's length. The skeptics evolved their positions in ways Serafina found quietly amusing. Jedediah Stone, who'd predicted death by smoke or cold, started sending people to the cave specifically. You get caught between here and Silver Creek after dark, head for the Bellwether Cave. 4 miles east, sandstone formations. You can't miss it. Warmest shelter between Tombstone and Tucson, and I'll fight anyone who says different. Father Thorne still thought she should move to town, but he stopped calling it desperation and started calling it an innovative application of old world principles to new world challenges, which was priest speak, for I was wrong, but won't quite say so. The real test came January 28th, 1874. Weather had been cold but manageable for 2 weeks. Daytime temperatures around 25 degrees, nights dropping to maybe 10 below. Then the wind shifted north, and the sky turned that particular shade of yellow-gray. That meant serious trouble. Serafina had seen that sky once before, the winter of 72 that killed her husband. Barometric pressure, dropping like a stone temperature, falling 5 degrees per hour, wind building to a steady roar. By 3 p.m., it was snowing horizontally. By 4 p.m., visibility was 6 feet. By 5 p.m., the temperature had dropped to 8 below and was still falling. Lars had been in Silver Creek buying supplies. Should have been back by noon. Serafina stood at the cave entrance watching the world disappear into white static, calculating distances and survival times in her head. 15 miles to Silver Creek. If he'd left at noon, he'd be halfway home. If he'd left at 1 p.m., he'd be 8 miles out. If he'd waited for the storm to pass, he'd be safe in town, and she'd be alone with her worry. But Lars wasn't the waiting type. Lars was the type to trust his strength and navigation skills, to figure he could push through weather that would stop lesser men, the type who'd tried to winter in a railroad tie cabin and ended up sleeping in someone else's cave. She built up the fire pit until the stones glowed orange, hung extra tarpaulins across the entrance to create a windbreak, set water to heat for coffee. Then she walked to the entrance and started listening between wind gusts for anything that sounded like human movement. Found him at 7 p.m., or more accurately, found his horse. The animal had walked straight into the sandstone formation and stopped unable to go forward, too exhausted to turn back. Lars was still in the saddle, but unconscious hands frozen to the reins, face covered in ice from his own breath. Temperature had dropped to 23 below. Wind chill was pushing 60 below. Serafina got him down from the horse. He weighed maybe 180 pounds of dead weight and dragged him the final 30 yards to the cave entrance. Got him inside. Got the horse inside because leaving an animal to freeze was unthinkable, and also because that horse represented 3 months' wages, and Lars would need it come spring. The cave that night held one unconscious Swedish homesteader, one exhausted Bavarian woman, one terrified horse, and a fire pit working overtime to generate heat. Serafina cut away Lars's frozen boots. The leather had gone stiff as iron and found his feet white and waxy, with frostbite, both hands similarly affected. She'd seen this before, seen what happened when you tried to warm frozen flesh too quickly. So she did what her grandmother had taught her, wrapped his feet and hands in cloth soaked in cool water, gradually warmed the water over the course of 3 hours, let his tissue thaw slowly enough that cells didn't rupture and die, kept him wrapped in dry blankets. But away from the fire pits, in direct heat forced warm broth down his throat when he regained consciousness around midnight, delirious and fighting her help. By morning, the storm had reached its peak. Temperature outside 41 degrees below zero. Wind sustained at 45 miles per hour. Gusts to 68 wind chill, somewhere past 90, below cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. Inside the cave front chamber, holding steady at 35 degrees rear chamber at 44, the fire pit stones were still warm. From the previous night's burning, the horse had calmed down enough to accept water and some of their precious hay. Lars could feel his fingers again, which meant the frostbite was first-degree painful, but recoverable. His feet would take longer. The storm lasted 3 days, not 3 days of heavy snow, but 3 days of sustained Arctic air that turned Arizona territory into a frozen version of itself. The temperature didn't rise above zero until February 1st. Daytime highs stayed below 15 degrees for a week after that. In Silver Creek, 7 people died too from carbon monoxide when they sealed their cabins too tight, trying to keep warm 3 from freezing, when their fuel ran out 2 from hypothermia when they tried to reach neighbors and got disoriented in ground blizzards. The death toll was light compared to some winters. Serafina's cave didn't fail, and here's something worth considering. If you value these stories about the practical knowledge that kept people alive on the frontier, hit that like button. It helps us reach others who care about preserving this history. There's wisdom in these old survival techniques that still matters today. Word spread fast after the January blizzard. By mid-February, Serafina was getting visitors who weren't frozen freighters or desperate travelers. They were settlers who wanted to see how cave dwelling worked, wanted to measure the temperature differential, wanted to understand the stone fire heat principle. Arthur Wells, a Dutch engineer working for the Arizona Central Railway, spent 2 hours examining her fire pit system and taking notes. This is brilliant. Simple but brilliant. You're using thermal mass storage with gravity-fed ventilation. The Romans did this 2,000 years ago with their Hippocaust systems. Worked in Rome, works in Arizona. Same physics. He'd sketched her setup in a leather notebook, asked permission to share the design with other homesteaders. Serafina had shrugged. Knowledge isn't property. Use it if it helps. The design did help. By late February, 4 other families in the Sierra Valley had modified their shelters using Serafina's principles. The Johnsons dug a root cellar and lived in it instead of their drafty cabin, gained 12 degrees of temperature stability. The Chen family Chinese railroad workers turned homesteaders built a second interior wall in their existing cabin, creating a dead airspace, cut their firewood consumption by 40%. Old Johann Richter, a German stonemason, constructed a fire pit system identical to Serafina's, and reported that his wife's rheumatism improved within a week from sleeping in steady temperature instead of wild swings. March brought the inevitable question of permanence. Lars recovered fully, except for losing 2 toes to frostbite, not unusual for Arizona winters. He'd proposed marriage in late February with practical assessment rather than poetry. I've got claim and farming knowledge. You've got engineering sense and toughness. Together, we'd have a better chance than either of us alone. Also, we haven't killed each other in 3 months, which is more than most married couples can claim. Serafina had accepted partly because she'd grown fond of him, partly because marriage meant legal access to his homestead claim and the resources to improve it. They were married on April 3rd, 1874, by Father Thorne, in a ceremony attended by 47 people. The wedding gift from the community lumber to build a cabin on Lars's claim with modifications. They constructed it partially earth-bermed with 3 feet of soil against the north wall for wind protection, built a stone fire pit system identical to the caves, created a double wall design with a 6-inch air gap. The result was a hybrid. Looked like a cabin from the front. Functioned like a cave where it mattered. Heat consumption dropped 60% compared to standard construction. Serafina kept the cave, used it for cold storage, which worked perfectly. Steady 45-degree temperature year-round meant root vegetables lasted months longer than in conventional cellars. Used it as a storm shelter because even the improved cabin couldn't match solid rock for protection when wind hit 70 miles per hour and the temperature dropped past 40 below. Used it as a reminder that survival often came from working with the land instead of against it, from observation instead of assumption, from being willing to adapt old world knowledge to new world problems. The story would be satisfying enough if it ended there. Rejected woman builds cave shelter, proves skeptics wrong, lives happily with her practical Swedish husband, but the frontier had one more test in mind. Winter of 1876 arrived early and stayed late. First snow. October 29th. Ground didn't fully thaw until May 8th. Temperature dropped below zero on November 12th and stayed there with minor exceptions until March 4th. This was the winter the old-timers talked about for the next 50 years, the winter that killed cattle by the thousands and broke homesteaders by the hundreds. This was the winter when every marginal structure failed, when adequate became inadequate, when good enough proved fatal. On January 17th, 1875, the temperature hit 50 degrees below zero in Silver Creek. Not wind chill actual air temperature. The creek froze solid to the bottom. Cottonwood trees exploded from ice expansion, in their trunks sounding like rifle shots in the pre-dawn darkness. Smoke from chimneys didn't rise. It fell because the smoke was warmer than the air, and warm air doesn't rise when the air above it is even colder. This was cold that defied logic, cold that killed quickly and without mercy. Serafina and Lars had prepared their cabin as well as anyone could. Double walls, earth-burning stone, fire pit, extra insulation in the roof cavity. They'd stocked firewood enough for 4 months of heavy burning, had food for the same duration, had candles and lamp oil and everything the mercantile recommended for winter preparation. The cabin held steady at 48 degrees, while outside touched 50 below. Not comfortable, but survivable. They burned firewood, constantly fed the fire pit every 3 hours, dressed in layers, even indoors. Got through January 17th, then the 18th, then the 19th. On the 20th, the temperature rose to 30 below, which felt tropical by comparison. They allowed themselves to relax. Mistake. On January 22nd, the wind came. Not just wind, but a sustained blast from the north that hit 65 miles per hour and held there for 16 hours straight. Wind at that speed doesn't flow around obstacles. It finds every weakness, every gap, every imperfection in construction and exploits it ruthlessly. The cabin that had handled static cold couldn't handle dynamic wind. The double wall system failed first. Wind pressure forced air through the gaps, turning their insulation into a convection system that stripped heat instead of holding it. The fire pit kept the temperature from collapsing completely, but by midnight the inside temperature had dropped to 35 degrees and was falling 2 degrees per hour. Lars was burning firewood so fast they'd exhaust their supply in a week. The door rattled in its frame, hard enough that Serafina worried it would tear loose entirely. At 2 a.m., with the inside temperature at 28 degrees and the fire pit consuming fuel at an unsustainable rate, Serafina made the call. We go to the cave, now, before we're too cold to move. Lars didn't argue. They dressed in every layer they owned, loaded what supplies they could carry in 2 minutes, and stepped into wind that nearly knocked them flat. The cave was 200 yards away, might as well have been 2 miles. Visibility was zero, not from snow, but from ground drift, frozen crystals lifted and hurled by wind strong enough to strip flesh. They held hands and walked, counting steps, because navigation by sight was impossible. Serafina had walked this route 100 times, knew it was 240 steps from their door to the cave entrance. At step 180, she started thinking they'd miscalculated, started imagining they'd veered off course and were walking parallel to the formations instead of toward them. At step 220, she was certain they were lost. At step 237, they walked into solid stone and knew they'd made it. Inside the cave, the temperature was 43 degrees. No wind, no noise except their own breathing and the distant howl of the storm outside. They stood in the front chamber, shaking from cold and adrenaline, and then they started laughing. Not joyful laughter, but the slightly unhinged sound of people who'd just bet their lives on geological stability and won. They weren't alone for long. The same storm that drove them from their cabin drove others to the cave. By dawn, on January 23rd, 13 people had taken shelter there. The Johnsons with their 3 children, the Chen's old Johann Richter, a freighter named Patrick O'Connell, who'd been caught between settlements, and Arthur Wells, who'd abandoned his railroad survey camp when the tents started tearing loose. 13 people who should have been scattered across 12 miles of frozen prairie now packed into a cave that Serafina had chosen because it was deep enough to hold heat and high enough to prevent smoke accumulation. They stayed there for 6 days. The storm lasted that long, wind sustained above 55 miles per hour, with temperatures ranging from 25 below to 45 below. Outside conditions were unsurvivable. The death toll for that storm, later calculated across Arizona territory, was 217 people. Entire families froze in their cabins when fuel ran out. Riders froze in their saddles, trying to reach safety. Livestock died by the thousands, frozen in place, where they'd clustered for warmth. In the cave, nobody died. Temperature held steady between 42 and 48 degrees. The fire pit system scaled beautifully. Burnstones hot. Once daily, they'd release heat gradually for 24 hours. 13 people generated enough body heat to raise the rear chamber temperature 5 additional degrees. Food was rationed, but adequate. Water came from melted snow. The biggest problem was boredom. 13 people with nothing to do but wait and tell stories and discover that survival was mostly tedium, punctuated by brief moments of terror. On the 6th day, the wind stopped. Temperature rose to 10 below, which felt positively warm. They emerged from the cave to find a landscape transformed. Snow had drifted into waves 10 feet high, in places, bare ground, in others, where the wind had scoured everything down to frozen earth. Serafina and Lars's cabin had survived structurally, but every window was blown out and the door had torn halfway off of its hinges. The Johnson cabin had lost its entire roof. The Chen place had collapsed, completely one wall blown inward by wind pressure. Of the 13 people who'd sheltered in the cave, only 3 had homes they could return to immediately. The others stayed in the cave for another week while they rebuilt. By February 1875, the cave had become a formal community shelter. The settlers pooled resources to improve it, built permanent sleeping platforms, installed a proper door with iron hinges donated by the Tombstone blacksmith, constructed a secondary chamber by excavating deeper into the sandstone using picks and patience. Arthur Wells drew up formal plans, documenting the design, submitted them to the territorial government, with the proposal that similar shelters be constructed as strategic points along major routes. The proposal went nowhere. Governments move slowly, and frontier settlers move fast, but the plans themselves circulated. Within a year, 7 cave shelters existed across Arizona territory, each one built by settlers who'd heard the story and recognized with good sense when they saw it. Serafina's original cave became a landmark. Freight haulers marked it on their maps as a reliable storm shelter. Riders knew they could find emergency warmth there. The community maintained it, kept firewood stocked, kept the fire pit functional, kept the sleeping platforms clean. It saved lives repeatedly. A count made in 1882 estimated that 45 people had sheltered there during severe weather over an 8-year period. Impossible to know how many would have died without it, but the number wasn't zero. If these stories of frontier ingenuity and survival resonate with you, consider subscribing. We're working to document this knowledge before it disappears completely, to preserve the practical wisdom that built communities in impossible conditions. These weren't just survival stories. They were lessons in observation, adaptation, and respecting what the land could teach us. Serafina lived in the Sierra Valley until 1905, raised 4 children with Lars, and became known as someone who solved problems by watching how nature solved them first. She never stopped using the cave, stored food there year-round, sheltered there during storms, eventually used it as a schoolhouse during summer months when temperature regulation made it more comfortable than any wooden structure. Her last recorded visit was in April 1905, age 67, walking 3 miles to show her grandchildren where she'd lived the winter of 1873. The cave remained functional into the 1920s. The formations were eventually incorporated into a state land preserve, and the cave entrance was documented by archaeologists in 1967 who found Serafina's original fire pit still intact, stones still showing heat marks from burning. They carbon-dated charcoal deposits and confirmed usage from 1873 through approximately 1915. There's a historical marker there now 4 miles east of what used to be the Kowalski claim, explaining in 200 words what took Serafina 1 winter to prove. That survival on the frontier wasn't about overpowering nature, but about understanding it well enough to use its principles. That thermal mass storage worked in Rome and Arizona for the same reasons. That skepticism was healthy, but observation was better. That sometimes the best shelter was the one that had already been there for 10,000 years, waiting for someone practical enough to recognize it. Modern engineers studying passive solar design and geothermal stability use Serafina's cave as a case study. The temperature data collected in the 1960s confirmed what she'd known intuitively. That sandstone formations in that region maintain year-round temperatures between 42 and 49 degrees, regardless of surface conditions. That proper ventilation can be achieved through simple gravity-fed systems. That thermal mass will always outperform insulation alone for temperature stability. Her fire pit design appears in survival manuals and off-grid building guides. The principle she demonstrated, that working with geology instead of against it provides superior results with minimal resources, shows up in modern, sustainable architecture under different terminology but identical physics. The frontier is gone. The conditions that made Serafina's cave necessary don't exist anymore in Arizona, but the knowledge she demonstrated, the willingness to observe and adapt and trust what worked instead of what was conventional, that remains valuable. Maybe more valuable now than then in a world that's forgotten how much our ancestors knew about living with less, about finding solutions in geology and physics instead of hardware stores. Serafina Bellwether's story isn't about conquering nature. It's about paying attention to what nature was already doing and being smart enough to get out of the way and let it work. Sometimes the best tool is observation. Sometimes the best shelter is the one that requires the least fighting. And sometimes wisdom looks like a Bavarian woman standing at a cave entrance in 1873, watching smoke rise from her sister's chimney and deciding that rejection might be the best thing that ever happened to her. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Give this video a like if you found value in Serafina's story, and remember that these techniques, this knowledge, these solutions, they worked then and the principles still work now. We just have to be willing to learn from them